With the snare, same thing. The snare is radically different. The snare is, known as, that's going to be the most distinctive thing in the kit for most records. There are tons of different snares on the market. There's thin ones, deep ones, big ones, small ones, and they all yield different sounds. There again, like I said, if you want a big snare sound, use a bigger snare, deeper snare. The depth is volume, the width is actually relative to the pitch. And the same thing applies for the toms there as well, or whatever. But like I said, for Tommy's, record, we wanted a big rock sound, so we used just a big snare, a 14-inch snare, 6-inch deep snare. And this is, a great Ludwig snare that gives you a great, like, classic rock sound. It's a sound you've heard a million times in a million records and stuff. So, but basically, like I said, there's the tuning approach that I use on the toms doesn't apply to the snare as much. Usually, like I said, the bottom snare, as many of you guys know, has a thinner, snare side head, that comes to your factory, and you want to keep that snare side because it, interacts with the actual snares. These, the metal strands are the actual snares of the drums that produce the, the white noise effect. So basically, if you want a lot of snare articulation, you want the bottom tight. If you want a washy kind of snare sound, kind of a sloshy type of sound or whatever, then you want them loose. I want this bottom head loose. The same thing with the strands or whatever. You want it has a tightener on the side of the snare drum, as many of you guys know. If you want a lot of articulation, say you're a drummer that does a lot of ghost notes and that type of thing, a lot of really articulate things, you want this tighter. If you want, a bigger sound that's more washy and it kind of blends together, kind of like maybe a symphonic snare type sound, you might want to run the snares a little more loose. Tons of different products on the market, tons of different snare strands, different, even the string that holds the snare on affects the sound, I've found. Like you have the nylon strap, you have the classic string strap things, and it's crazy. But, that's just like experimenting. I'm a big fan, like I said, let the band or the artist sound the way they sound. So if somebody brings in something, a snare that they've chosen or whatever, and check it out, see what it sounds like, set it up, mic it up, see what, yeah, and just go from there. And like I said, that's the most expressive drum on the drum set or whatever, is the snare drum. So, so there are no rules with the tensions. Obviously you want to keep the tensions, the same around the drum, just like with the toms. And these all are, because we've already tuned this. But the same thing, you want to start low.
Do you tune with the snares on the head, or do you normally?
You can do either way. Okay. I normally do, just because, But you can turn the snares off, and you can hear the pitch a lot better, with the snares off. But like I said, with the same thing with the toms or whatever, you want to do that whole stretch in thing. And I didn't mention on the kick, but you want to stretch it in also. Usually, like when I'm setting up the kick, I do the stretching thing. But you want to do it with snare. And like I said, I mean, there's so many different tones, and we were talking on our podcast about, the higher, like with Finn or whatever, about the higher snares, that we used to listen to. Yeah, in the 90s, and people, like the Snapcase bands like that, they just had a really like cracky sound. To me, there's, it's like, I mean, a lot of people would be like, I don't like that sound, but it might work with a particular band, and that might be the way they want it to sound. So if that's the way they want it to sound, crank the snare tuning up. It's all an opinion at the end of the day. And like I said, the snare being the most expressive thing, I usually try to just go with what the client's got going on naturally. But for this particular project, we wanted a rock sound, not a lot of overtone. I'm gonna hit the snare drum now, but this is without muffling. You hear all the ring and stuff. Yeah, it's brighter. It's got the overtones and ring, which we probably don't want a lot of in the recording. One thing I'll say about the snare drum is that the natural compression of the SM57 that I normally use on the snare, and that most people normally use on the snare, the natural compression and the compression we're going to use in the mix and EQ and things like that, that'll actually, if you got ring in your snare, it's going to accentuate that when you compress it. The mic does, and so I found that you kind of need a little bit of muffling, like a moon gel or something like that, unless the drummer is really articulate and hits dead center every time. If you play to the side, you're going to get more ring. take this. You know, some drummers play more to the side, some play direct center. So, but I usually find a little bit of muffling helps. But for this, we have a relatively low tuned snare, you know, semi-washy snare because there's not a lot of ghost noting in this song, things like that. But just kind of a fat, classic, you know, 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s or whatever. Tommy was kind of really inspired by the grunge stuff or whatever for this record. This actual song that we're doing was actually, you know, temporarily just called grunge. I hope you don't mind me saying that. But yeah, so
my creative.
It's appropriate that
titles.
We're near Seattle right now, so, and doing this song. But
I think it was cool what you said. Just for reference, you said the bigger, like the wider across it is, the lower the note is.
Yeah.
And then the depth is the volume. So you could just literally just look at a snare and know.
And kind of get an idea what it's going to sound like. Yeah.
Based on whether it's wood or metal, and then the size.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and you brought up the wood and metal thing. I mean, obviously there are tons of different tones. You know, the metal snares aren't as popular as they used to be. But obviously the metal snares are going to sound brighter. They're going to have more attack. I'm a really big fan of recording metal snares. You know, because it's less EQ work on the high end, you know, and the more high end you boost on the snare, you're going to bring in cymbals and all stuff, all kinds of other stuff with an acoustic kit. So it's nice to have a head and a snare configuration that produces a lot of natural high end. But yeah, the wood affects it, but it's all a preference. You know, a lot of people ask me like, hey, what snare are we going to use? And I'm like, whatever you want. You know, just hit a snare, whatever one you like. And one thing I will say about drums and snare drums in particular, what it sounds like acoustically almost means nothing. You know, in terms of on the recording, because you really need to check out what the snare drum sounds like recorded. Because like I said, the 57 kind of naturally compresses the sound, being a dynamic mic and having proximity effect. It naturally compresses the sound, so you want to hear it with the mic on there, with some light EQ and production, to kind of get an idea of what it really sounds like. A lot of people they try to tune their snare to sound like the produced snare that they're hearing on a record, and they don't realize that snare actually sounded quite a bit more trashy or fat in the original. Like if you tune the snare like you're accustomed to hearing it, kind of compressed and controlled and tight and poppy. If you tune your snare like that, and then you put the mic and then you compress, then it's going to sound like a cardboard box. It's a different translation. This ear is hearing it different than your human ear, basically.
Yeah, that's something I've learned over. I mean, with every instrument, just over the years, is
guitar's huge.
You always want. You're like, this is my tone, but when you record it, it's everything sounds different.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have to be very open. I think that's what's important. Having a good engineer is
someone who knows that and can help translate your sound to the final product, and and things like I said that how when you start layering up things and it changes the way. Stuff, like your normal snare drum sound, you might like a big fat snare drum sound, but you didn't realize
it might get lost in the mix.
It might get lost in the mix. You're like, man, we might need to tighten the snare drum up, or use a metal snare drum because it's kind of dull. I'm not hearing the ghost notes and things. So basically, this is all guesses. Like I said, you want to try, you want to get it in a ballpark where you think would work or whatever, and then just record some stuff and try it out. And if it's not working out, then you want to make some adjustments and stuff.